Chapter 6 of The City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 6 Caravan into Tomorrow. Keniston lost track of his own emotions very quickly in the rush of urgent tasks. City Hall became the nerve center of the evacuation. The police and National Guard officers were already there, and other men were called in: the wholesale grocers, the warehouse men, the heads of trucking and bus and van lines. McLean, the big raw-boned manager of the largest trucking company, proved a tower of strength. He had been a transport officer in the last war and knew something about moving men and supplies. "You'll have a traffic madhouse, and you won't get these people out for weeks," he said crisply. "It's got to be organized by wards. There have to be quarters in your domed city assigned for each ward, so they can go into their own streets when they get there." Hubble nodded. "I can get a crew of 20 men ready to handle that." "Good. I figure the move will take 3 days. A third of the population is about all we can handle safely at one time. Civilian populations are the devil and all. Now, there'll have to be a squad assigned to distribute fuel to the ones who have to wait here in Middletown, and to quarter them as to conserve that fuel. Also—" Hubble sighed. "You take a big load off my mind, McLean. Will you organize the march? Keniston can lead the first contingent when you're ready." McLean nodded brusquely, sat down at someone else's desk, and began to fire orders. Hubble departed with his 20 picked men, well armed, to set up a base in the domed city. The radio chattered incessantly now, urging, soothing, cajoling, issuing instructions. Police and guardsmen were dispatched to each ward, with a responsible man heading each squad. They were ordered to take the streets house by house, to assure complete evacuation, and also to ascertain how many private cars could be counted on for transportation. The city buses could carry only a fraction of the evacuees. McLean was the one who thought of the patients in the Middletown hospitals, and set men to collecting ambulances, hearses, whatever would carry the sick comfortably. The police patrol wagons and a few big army trucks from the armory he assigned to move prisoners in the jail who could not safely be released. But they and the sick would be left until the last day, to ensure proper quarters for their reception. Fleets of trucks were started to the warehouses, with hasty lists of the food and other emergency supplies that must go with them. "We can run a truck line back to Middletown for more supplies later," McLean told Keniston, "but this stuff we'll need right away." The first and second wards were to go first, and that meant that Carol and her aunt would be in the first day's evacuation. Keniston managed to get away long enough to see them. He was sorry he went. Mrs. Adams sat weeping in the living room, and Carol struggled alone with blankets and mattresses and suitcases, in a bitter, stony-faced mood that Keniston could not quite understand. He stayed longer than he should have done to help them pack, trying earnestly to penetrate Carol's tight-lipped silence. "I know it's hard to leave your home," he said, "but it's hard for everybody. And after all, we'll have shelter and warmth, and can stay alive." "Shelter and warmth," said Carol. She looked around at the starched white curtains, the polished furniture, the pictures on the walls, and the bits of fine china that were so lovingly placed, and she said bitterly, "We had those. We had them for generations, until we had to have scientific progress, too." "I'll admit you have a point there," said Keniston heavily, "but it's too late to argue now." "Yes," she said, "too late." Suddenly she began to cry, in a slow, painful way that was not in the least like Mrs. Adams' whimpering. "Oh, Ken, my house and all the things I loved." She had wit enough to know that it was not for glass and china that she wept, but for a way of life that was gone and could never possibly return. He felt a terrible pity for her, which almost smothered his irritation at the inability of the female mind to grapple with the essentials of a situation. "It won't be so bad," he said reassuringly. "And I'll be leading tomorrow's first evacuation, and won't be far from you at any time." It was before 9 o'clock the next morning when Kenniston left City Hall with McLean to check the progress of preparations. Under the cold red eye of the sun, Middletown seethed with an excited activity that centered in the first and second wards. Cars were being hastily loaded, piled high on roofs and fenders. Children were being called together, barking dogs being caught and leashed, families gathering in excited haste. Roar of motors filled the wintry air. Motors of great trucks rumbling to and from the warehouse. Motors of police cars dashing with sirens screaming. Sputtering motors of old cars being agonizedly coaxed to life. The people on the streets, the people hurrying with bundles and children and dogs, looked more dazed than frightened. Some of them were laughing, a false merriment edged with excitement. Only a few women were sobbing. McLean and Kenniston rode down in the jeep to the center of town, the square. This was the downtown First Ward of Middletown. "The First and Second Ward will move out in that order," McLean told Kenniston. "You take charge of the First, since you're to lead the way." Police and National Guardsmen were already forming up cars on South Jefferson Street. Cadillacs, Buicks, Fords, ancient Hupmobiles. City and school buses were crowded with those who had no cars, and piled high with their belongings. Policemen on motorcycles roared past. McLean boomed rapid orders. "Get sidecars on those motorcycles. They won't make it without them over rough ground. Divide up the garbage tow trucks as they come in. Divide them evenly between the wards so they can haul any car that conks out." And to a worried National Guard officer, "No! What the devil use would we have for your field guns? Leave 'em in the armory and bring cots, blankets, camp equipment instead." Then McLean commandeered a car, jumped in, and shouted back to Kenniston, "Have 'em ready to move out by noon. I'll have the tube mill whistle sounded for a starting signal." And he was gone, racing off to the other ward gathering point. Kenniston found himself faced by police, guardsmen, deputies, officials, all clamoring for orders. "What are we going to do with these cars? Half of them are so overloaded they'll never get anywhere." Kenniston saw that. The arriving cars were piled not only with bedding and other essentials, but with radios, musical instruments, big framed family portraits, hobby horses, every sort of possession. "Go along and tear some of that junk off," he ordered. "Form up all the way down South Jefferson, but only 2 abreast, for some of those South Side streets are narrow." As he sweated to marshal the gathering cars, he watched for Carol's blue coupe. When she came, driving with pale self-possession while her aunt looked scaredly at the jam, he got her as near the front of the form-up as he could, and then raced back to the square. The squad leaders rapidly reported in on their assigned streets. "Everybody's out of Adams Street. Everybody's out of Perry Street. Lincoln Avenue. But we haven't got 'em all out of North Street, Mr. Kenniston. Some of those old people just won't go." Kenniston swore, and then jumped back into the jeep and drove around to North Street. It was the street of shabby, ancient brick houses only 2 blocks off Main Street. And the first person he saw there was a grim-looking, shawled old woman standing with folded arms on her front porch. "I'm not leaving my home," she snapped to Kenniston before he could speak. "I've lived in this house all my life, and my mother before me. I'll not leave it now." She sniffed scornfully. "The idea of the whole town taking up and running away just because it's got a little cold." Kenniston, baffled, saw a little girl of 6 peering at him from inside the window of the house. "That your granddaughter?" he asked. "Listen, she'll be dead in a few days. Stone frozen dead. unless you bring her and your warm clothes and blankets along now." The shawled old woman stared at him. Then, her voice suddenly dull, she asked, "Where do I go?" He hastened on along the street. A peppery old man was being carried out in a wheelchair by two squadmen, and was viciously striking at them with his cane. "God damn foolishness!" he was swearing. They got them into the waiting buses and hastily loaded on their belongings. Then Keniston raced back to the square. His watch said 11:10, and he knew how far they were from ready. On the square, under the big sycamore tree, a gaunt, tall man with burning eyes was brandishing a Bible and shouting to no one, "End of the world! Punishment for sin!" Lauber, the truck dispatcher whom McLean had left in charge of the First Ward caravan under Keniston, came running up to him when he reached South Jefferson. "These people are crazy," he panted. "The ones already here want to start right now, and they don't even know the way." Keniston saw that the police had drawn a barricade of big trucks across the street some blocks southward. Cars were surging against it, motors roaring, drivers shouting, horns sounding in a deafening chorus. Panic. He knew it was in the air. He, all of them, had known there was danger of it when the mayor had made his broadcast. They had had to risk it, for only real fear could make people leave their lifelong homes. But if it got out of hand— He rode along the line shouting, "Form up! Form in line! If you jam the street, you'll be left behind!" He couldn't even be heard. Limousines, trucks, jalopies, they crowded each other, banged fenders, bumped and recoiled and pressed forward again, and the horns never stopped their shrieking cacophony. Keniston, sweating now despite the frozen chill of the air, prayed that the gathering panic would not burst into violence. At the front of the surging, roaring mass he found Mayor Garris, and the mayor's pallid face showed that panic had infected him too. "Shouldn't we go?" he shouted to Keniston over the uproar of horns and motors. "Everyone seems ready here." "McLean's running the traffic movement, and we've got to stick to his orders," he shouted back. "But if these people break loose—" the mayor began. He stopped. Over the shrieking horns and thundering motors, a new sound was rising. A distant, banshee wail. A faraway scream that swelled into a hoarse, giant howl. The auto horns, the shouting voices from the cars, fell silent. Only the sound of motors was background to that unending scream that wailed across Middletown like a requiem. "That's the 2 mil whistle!" cried Lauber. "That's the signal!" Keniston sent the jeep jumping ahead. "Okay, let those trucks roll! But keep people in line, back of them! No stampeding!" The big diesels that barricaded the way began to snort and rumble, and then started to move out, as ponderously as elephants. Keniston's jeep swung in front, but almost at once cars behind pressed to get around them. "Run the trucks 3 abreast in front!" he shouted to Lauber. "It'll keep them from getting around!" Down Jefferson Street, down over the muddy bed of the vanished river, past the old houses with their doors carefully shut and locked, past the playground that looked as forlorn as though it knew that children were going, never to return. Past Home Street, past the silent mills, past the beer signs of South Street, where from an upstairs window a drunken man shouted and waved a bottle at them. Past the last rows of drab frame houses, the last brave little yards whose flowers were blackened now by frost. Keniston saw ahead of them the line of demarcation, the boundary between the past and what was now Earth. They reached it, passed it. And then the rolling ochre-yellow plains were all about them, barren and drab beneath the great fire-lashed red eye of the sun. The cold wind whooped around them as they started to climb the easy slope toward the bridge. Behind his jeep, Diesels, jalopies, buses, shiny station wagons rolled with roaring, sputtering, purring motors. Keniston looked back down the slope at them. Already the other ward was moving out, and he rode at the head of a huge caravan of vehicles crawling endlessly out of Middletown, a caravan out of the earth that was gone forever into this unguessable tomorrow. End of Chapter 6. Of The City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 7. Under the Dome. When they came up over the bridge, and for the first time had view of the distant domed city that shimmered in the wan light far out on the desolate plain, Keniston could sense the shock of doubt and fear that ran through all of his host who were seeing it for the first time. He could see it in all their peering faces, pale and strained in the red light of the dying sun. Even he, seeing it for only the second time, felt an inner recoiling. With his mind still filled with every sight and sound and smell of the old town they had left, the alien, solemn, deathly city of the dome seemed to him impossible as a refuge. He choked down that feeling. He had to choke it down. It was go on or die. "Keep moving!" he shouted, sounding the jeep's horn to command attention, gesturing authoritatively forward. "Keep going!" He conquered that brief pause of recoil, got them moving over the ridge, skidding and sliding down the other slope in clouds of heavy dust. He glimpsed Mayor Garris staring ahead, his plump face shocked and pallid. He wondered what Carol was thinking as she looked out at the lonely shining rubble in the sad wastes. The endless caravan, shrouded in dust, was halfway down the long slope when Keniston heard a raging of horns and looked back. An old sedan had stopped squarely in the middle of the narrow track the trucks had beaten down across a shallow gully. Cars were pulling out around it, wallowing in soft earth, jamming their low-hung frames against the banks, getting inextricably tangled. Behind them, the line was damming up. Keniston yelled to Lauber to keep the head of the caravan moving on toward the distant dome, and then sent his jeep snorting back along the line. A knot of people had collected now around the offending sedan. Keniston hastily shouldered his way through them. "What the hell's going on here?" he demanded. "Whose car is this?" A weather-beaten middle-aged man turned to him, half scared, half apologetic. "Mine. My car. I'm John Borzak." He gestured to the back seat of the old sedan. "My wife. She's having a baby in there." He added as an afterthought, "My fifth." "Oh, Christ, that's all we needed," Keniston cried. Borzak looked instantly guilty. He looked so sad that Keniston began to laugh. Suddenly, all of them were laughing, in sheer relief from nervous tension. He set men scurrying to get a doctor and ambulance out of the procession, and meanwhile willing hands carefully rolled the old sedan a little aside. The dammed-up lines of cars began to roll again. But the pause, the waiting, the minutes spent in staring at the drear landscape, had been too much for some of those in line. Keniston saw cars, only a few of them as yet, curving out of line and scrambling on the slope to swing back toward Middletown. He'd feared that above all things. People of a 20th century Middle Western town, could take only so much of the unknown. But he had to stop them, or panic would spread like fire that nobody could stop. He bucketed the jeep after them, got ahead of them by the advantage of his four-wheel drive, and then blocked their way back and stood up in the jeep and shouted at them and pointed ahead. A man who looked like an aging carpenter, with a knobby face sheet-pale now, cursed Keniston out of the depths of his fear. We're not going out to die in this damned desert. We're going back home." "You'll never even get near it," Keniston warned. "There are special guards who won't let anyone back into Middletown. Get it into your heads that the place is a death trap, will you?" "Oh, Hugh, maybe we'd better go on," whimpered the shapeless woman beside the man. "Like hell we will! I'm a free American, and this isn't any dictatorship." Keniston found the only argument that could sway these people who were recoiling from the deathliness of the desert. "If you go back, if you do get into Middletown and stay there, you'll soon be all alone there. You and the few like you. All alone, here at the end of the world, with the night and the cold." That got to them, replacing their fear with a greater dread, the dread of aloneness in this lonely world. The knobby-faced man looked sick and trapped, but he finally turned his car around, and the other cars followed him back into line. Keniston's squad cars had come up, but they weren't needed. He told them, "Watch the line close. Don't let one start to turn again. Not one." He fought the jeep back up along the line, choking on dust and exhaust fumes, hanging precariously to the wheel, deafened by the continuous roar of motors. At the head of the caravan, he was at least out of the dust, and could look ahead at the distant city. It was still only a shimmering, tiny bubble on the horizon, only a glittering point lost and drowned in the vast indifference of the ochre-colored wastes that stretched— how far? Clear around the world, over the beds of dried-up oceans and the sites of vanished cities? Was the bottom of the Atlantic like this? Was New York? Was Paris? Were the poles? He had to forget that and keep his mind on the city ahead, on the job of getting these thousands of people to it, for if he didn't, the weight of the whole dying world would come down upon him like an avalanche, and he would cease to struggle. The world couldn't all be like this. There must be green valleys and people somewhere yet. But there wasn't time to think of it now. They had hit the road that led to the portal, and the dome of man's last refuge was towering, colossal, in front of them. He saw that Hubbell's men had closed the portal. That would be the first step, of course, to conserve what warmth there was and keep out the frigid wind. It opened now to receive them, and an armed man waved and smiled, and then clung on to the side of the jeep. "Straight up this boulevard and then turn. I'll show you. Yeah, we got the section ready. No sign of anything. I don't think even a mouse lives here anymore." A pause. "I'm sure glad you people have got here. This place is so damn quiet, it would scare you." The tall, white, silent towers watched them, the long line of dusty cars and trucks and buses that crept along the empty boulevards. The noise of motors greatly magnified echoed and rebounded from the walls and was repeated faintly from the dome, and the very shocking loudness of the sound made Keniston shiver. Apart from that mechanical racket, a curious hush had come over the Middletowners. All down the lines, heads were thrust forth out of car windows, looking, peering, savoring the height of the buildings whose tops they could not see, staring at the lines and colors that were alien to all they knew, listening to the emptiness. Keniston knew how they felt. It was too big and too strange. Even a native New Yorker would have found awe among these mighty towers, and to the folk of Middletown, used to the little slate-roofed houses and the squat buildings of dingy brick, they were overpowering, crushing, with something in them of dread because they were all deserted. The head of the caravan reached a section that was barred off with ropes. The ropes were laid aside, and the cars went in. Hubbell's advance squad was ready. Without them, the assignment of nearly 17,000 people to improvised quarters would have been impossible. With them, it was a scrambling chaos, carried out strangely without much noise. Men and women moved with a sort of stunned docility, glancing sidelong into the dust and the shadows, peering at the blank windows and the tall, strange rooms, afraid to raise their voices. Gradually, the sound of motors died and the streets were ghastly in their silence, and it was a silence so great that the scuffling of many feet and the murmur of many voices and the labor of unpacking trucks and cars did not disturb it, but were merely lost. Even the dogs were cowed. Keniston made his report to Hubble and then went in search of Carol. Here and there, people still sat in their cars, refusing to move from their one last familiar reality, and he passed a woman who crouched in the dust of the street and wept, with her arms full of blankets. Something of the same feeling of despair infected Keniston. It was not going to work. It was not going to work at all, and he dreaded to talk to Carol. But he plodded on until he found her. There was a great vaulted room on the street level, smelling dismally of the dust and desertion of ages. Very tall windows let in what light they could, but still it was dusky. There were 20 women in the room, of all sorts and ages, milling about with suitcases and loads of bedding, uttering vague wails and words of complaint, struggling with rolled-up mattresses. Carol and her aunt were 2 of the 20. Characteristically, they had managed to get off in a corner as much by themselves as possible. Mrs. Adams had collapsed onto her improvised bed, and Carol was making what order she could of their scanty belongings. "Are you all right?" he asked her anxiously, and she nodded. From the nested blankets on the floor, Mrs. Adams whimpered, "Why did they bring us here, to this dreadful place? Why couldn't they have let us stay at home?" Carol hushed her as she would a fretful child. 2 sniffling, mouse-faced girls had crept up to ask Keniston questions. Behind them, a short, thick, middle-aged woman was stamping up and down along the walls, banging open the doors that pierced them. "Where's the bathrooms?" she was demanding belligerently. Keniston took Carol to the doorway and a little beyond it, where, if there was no more privacy, they were at least not besieged. He said, "I know it's rough as hell now, but it's only for a little while. This bunking together, I mean. There's room enough for everybody here, and you can pick out a place you like, all to yourselves. I can fetch you anything you want from your house, your books and things, even furniture." She cut him short. "No, I don't want anything touched there. I want to know it's all just as I left it, so I can at least think about it, and maybe—" She shook her head, and then went on. "Ken, old Mr. Peters from our street had another stroke when we got here. They took him away on a stretcher. He was dying, and I saw his face. He was looking up at these awful buildings, so puzzled and afraid. He was trying to understand, and he couldn't." She shivered. "Dying isn't good anywhere you do it," he said. "But we're young and strong, and we aren't going to die." He added, before he left her, "There was a baby born on the march. Think of the baby, Carol, instead of the old man." He went away, depressed and worried. Carol seemed different, and he didn't think it was just her tiredness. Perhaps she had roots too deep, not just in Middletown, but in the pattern, the state of mind. Well, the pattern was smashed forever now, and she and all of them had to adjust. Keniston had gone 2 of the long squares, sunk in his disturbed thoughts, before he realized that a change had come into the streets. He tried to think what it was. People were more in the buildings now, and less in the cars, but that was not all of it. There was something. The streets had suddenly come alive. The children had done it. Overawed at first by the strangeness and the silence and the behavior of their elders, it had slowly dawned upon them that here was a whole great city lying ready to their hands, fabulous empty buildings full of mysteries and treasures, new streets, new narrow ways behind them, all virgin territory to be explored. By twos and threes, the venturesome spirits had started out and taken others with them. And now the lofty hallways rang with shouts and running feet. Small figures scudded to and fro across the pavement. The shadows teemed with motion, with screams and squeals and the voices of parental anger. One bull-lunged urchin had discovered that he could make echoes. Another, intoxicated by blank expanses of white, unsullied wall, stood with a stub of pencil in his hand writing in ever-enlarging letters. Keniston thought, "The irreverent little bastards." But his step quickened, and quite suddenly he felt that it was going to work out after all. The human race was tough. He had further evidence of that in the next 2 days. The great waves of the migration poured down across the dusty ridge and in through the portal, the clamorous thousands of wheels and motors, the countless faces and peering eyes. And for those who came on the second day and on the third, it was not so bad as it had been for those who came first. The 17,000 pioneers had lifted the curse of the empty stillness. Community kitchens, working on oil and gasoline ranges, filled the air with the homely, cheering smell of coffee. There was hot food, and the excitement of searching out friends and comparing notes. Indefatigable housewives busied themselves with brooms and drove their husbands to cleaning windows and whacked their unruly children. And the cars piled up in lines along the streets and boulevards, the Plymouths and Nashes and Chevrolets and Fords, incongruous in this dreamlike city of an elder Earth. On the third day, they brought the sick and put them in the hospital. They brought the prisoners from the jail and locked them away in another building. A great structure on the central plaza became the city hall. And by that third night, not a soul was left in Middletown. All were here under the great dome of the alien city. "We'll call this place New Middletown," Mayor Garris had proclaimed. "Makes it seem more like home." Keniston walked with Carol that night down one of the dark main avenues of the domed city. There was candlelight and lamplight from doorways and tall windows. A baby wailed from inside a dark doorway and was hastily soothed. Dogs barked defiance to alien ghosts. A tinny phonograph sang somewhere, "I can't give you anything but love, baby." Keniston thought that the streets of tall white buildings looked down with their windows as with eyes, amazed, bewildered. This city beneath the shimmering starlit dome had had silence for a long, long time. Silence and the slow swing of the cold red sun and the farther stars. Could a city remember, Keniston wondered? Did this one remember the old days of its builders, the lovers who had walked its ways and the children who had known its nooks and corners? Was it glad that men had come again, or did it regret the age-long silence and peace? Carol shivered a little and buttoned her topcoat. "It's getting colder." Keniston nodded. "But not bitterly so. Only like an October night back in our own time. We can stand that." She looked up at him, her eyes dark in the white blur of her face. "But how will we live here, Ken? I mean, when the food from Middletown's warehouses run out?" He and Hubble had known the question would come up, and had the answer for it. Not a perfect answer, but the only one. "There are big hydroponic tanks farther over in the city, Carol. The people here raise their food in them. We can do the same. There are plenty of seeds in Middletown." "But water?" "Lots of it," he answered promptly. "Big underground reservoirs that must tap deep water-bearing strata. Hubble had it tested, and it's perfectly safe." They walked on to the edge of the plaza. Now the moon was rising, that copper-colored, unreally big moon that was so much nearer Earth than in the old times. Its coppery light poured through the dome upon the city. The white towers dreamed, the chill deepened. The whole mighty past of dead Earth seemed to crush down upon Keniston. Millions of years, trillions of lives full of pain and hope and struggle, and all for what? For this? Carol felt it too, for she pressed closer to him. "Are they all dead, Ken? All the human race but ourselves?" He and Hubble had the answer for that too, the answer they would have to give to everyone. "There's no reason to assume that. There may be other cities that are still inhabited. If so, we'll soon contact them." She shook her head. "Words, Ken. You don't even believe them yourself." She drew away from him. "We're alone," she said. "Everything we had is gone. Our world, our whole life, and we're quite alone." He put his arms around her. He would have said something to comfort her, but she stood stiff and quivering, and suddenly she said, "Ken, there are times when I can't help hating you." Utterly shocked, and too bewildered to be angry yet, he let her go. He said, "Carol, you're wrought up, hysterical." Her voice was low and harsh. The words came fast, as though they could no longer be held back. "Am I? Maybe. But I can't help remembering that if you and men like you hadn't come to Middletown with that secret laboratory, 50,000 people wouldn't have had to suffer for it. You brought this on us." He began to understand now all that had been behind Carol's taut manner and unfriendly silences, all the blind resentment that had focused upon himself. He was, for the moment, furiously indignant, the more so because what she had said stung him on a sensitive nerve. He stood, almost glaring at her, and then his anger washed away, and he took her by the shoulders and said, "Carol, you're not making sense, and you know it. You're bitter because you've lost your home, your way of life, your world, and you're making me a scapegoat for that. You can't. We need each other more than ever, and we're not going to lose each other." She stared at him rigidly, then started to sob, and clung to him, crying. "Oh, Ken, don't let me be a fool. I'm so mixed up, I don't know my own mind anymore." "All of us feel like that," he said. "But it'll come all right. Forget about it, Carol." But as he held her and soothed her and looked past her at the alien towers and the face of the alien moon, he knew that she could not completely forget, that that deep resentment would not die easily, and that he would have to fight it. And it would be hard to fight, for there had been the sting of truth in her words, only a partial truth, but one he had not wanted ever to face. End of Chapter 7. Of the City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 8. Middletown Calling. When Keniston awoke, he lay for some time in his blankets looking around the great room, with the same feeling of unreality that he felt now each morning. It was quite a large room, with graceful curving walls and ceiling of soft-textured ivory plastic. But it was not as large as it looked, for the builders of the city had known how to use daringly jutting mezzanines to give 2 floor levels the spaciousness and loftiness of one. He looked up at the tall, dusty windows and wondered what this room had once been. It was part of a big structure on the plaza, for Mayor Garris had insisted that the whole lab staff be quartered near City Hall. It had obviously been a public building, but except for a few massive tables, it had been quite empty, and there was no clue to its function. He looked around at the others on the row of mattresses. Hubble was still sleeping calmly. So was Bites, with the slight, groaning stirrings of slumbering age. But Creasy lay wide awake and unmoving, looking up at the ceiling. Keniston remembered something with a sudden pang, something that he had completely forgotten in the rush of events. He went over to Creasy and whispered, "I'm sorry, Louis. I never thought until now about your girl." "Why would you think about that?" Creasy's low voice was toneless. "Why would you, when all this has happened?" He went on, as tonelessly, "Besides, it was all over a long time ago. For millions of years now, she's been dead." Keniston lingered a moment, seeking something to say, remembering now Creasy's eager talk of the girl he was soon to marry, the girl who lived 50 miles away from Middletown. He could find nothing to say. Creasy's tragedy had been repeated many times among these people: the mother whose son had gone to California, the wife whose husband had been upstate on a business trip, the lovers, the families, the friends, divided forever by the great gulf of time. He felt again a great thankfulness that Carol had come through with him, and a renewed determination to hold her against anything. Keniston was lighting his morning cigarette when the others rose. He paused suddenly and said, "I just thought—" Hubbell grinned at him. "Yes, I know. You just thought about tobacco. You and a lot of people will soon have to do without." As they went out to get their breakfast at the nearest community kitchen, Hubbell told him what was going forward. "McLean's going back to Middletown to bring gasoline engines and pumps. We have to get water flowing in the city system at once, and it may be a long time before we can figure out its pumping power. They seem to be atomic engines of some sort, but I'm not sure." "What about food rationing?" "Food and medicine will all go into guarded warerooms. Ration tickets will be printed at once. Use of cars is forbidden, of course. Everybody is restricted to their own ward district temporarily, to prevent accidents in exploration. We've already organized crews to explore the city." Keniston nodded. He drew the last drags of a cigarette, suddenly precious, before he spoke. "That's all good. But the main problem will be morale, Hubbell." He thought of Carol as he added, "I don't believe these people can take it, if they find out they're the last humans left." Hubbell looked worried. "I know, but there must be people left somewhere. This city wasn't abandoned because of sudden disaster. They may just have gone to other, better cities." "There wasn't a whisper on the radio from outside Middletown," Keniston reminded. "No, but I believe they used something different from our radio system. That's what I want you for this morning, Ken. Bites last night found a communication system in a building near here. It has big apparatus that he thinks was for televisor communication. That's more in your field than ours." Keniston felt a sharp interest, the interest of the technician that not even the world's end could completely kill. "I'd like to see that." As they walked through the cold red morning, Keniston was surprised by the unexpectedly everyday appearance of this alien city beneath the dome. Families were trooping toward the community kitchens with the air of going on picnic. A little band of children whooped down the nearest street, a small, woolly dog racing beside them with frantic barking. A bald, red-faced man in undershirt and trousers smoked his pipe and looked down the mighty street with mild curiosity. Two plump women, one of whom was buttoning a reluctant small boy into his jacket, called to each other from neighboring doorways. "And they say that Mrs. Byler's feeling better now, but her husband's still poorly." "Human beings," said Hubbell, "are adaptable. Thank God for that." "But if they're the last? They won't be able to adapt to that." Hubbell shook his head. "No, I'm afraid not." After breakfast, Bites led them to a big square building 2 blocks off the plaza. Inside was a large, shadowy hall, in which bulked a row of tall, square blocks of apparatus. They were obviously televisor instruments. Each had a square screen, a microphone grating, and beneath that a panel of control switches, pointer dials, and other less identifiable instruments. Keniston found and opened a service panel in the back of one. Brief examination of the tangled apparatus inside discouraged him badly. They were televisor communication instruments, yes, but the principles on which they worked are baffling. They didn't even use vacuum tubes. They'd apparently got beyond the vacuum tube. Could you start one of them transmitting again? Keniston shook his head. The video system is absolutely beyond me. No resemblance at all to our primitive television apparatus. Hubble asked, would it be possible then to use just the audio system? Use one of them as a straight sound radio transmitter? Keniston hesitated. That might be done. It'd be mostly groping in the dark, but there are some familiar bits of design. He pondered, then said, the power leads come from outside. See anything around here that looks like a power station? Old Bites nodded. Only a block away. Big shielded atomic turbines of some kind, coupled to generators. We might spend years trying to learn how to operate their atomic machinery, Keniston said. We could couple gasoline engines to those generators, Hubble suggested. It'd furnish power enough to try one of these transmitters. Keniston looked at him. Yes, if there are any of them, they'd not hear our kind of radio calls. But this is their own communication setup. They'd hear it. Keniston said finally, all right, give me power and I'll try. In the next few days, Keniston was so immersed in the overmastering fascination of the technical problem set him that he saw little of how Middletown's people were adapting to New Middletown. He could hear the trucks rumbling constantly under the dome as McLean indefatigably pushed the work of bringing supplies from the deserted town beyond the ridge. They brought the gasoline engines needed, not only to pump water from the great reservoirs, but also to turn one of the generators in the power station. Once he had power, Keniston began to experiment. Realizing the futility of trying to fathom the principles of the strange super-radio transmitters, he tried merely to deduce the ordinary method of operating them. The trucks brought other things: more food, clothing, furniture, hospital equipment, books. McLean began to talk of organizing a motor expedition to explore the surrounding country, and meanwhile the crews already organized to explore New Middletown itself were searching every block and building. Already they had made 2 surprising discoveries. Hubble took Keniston away from his work to see one of these. He led down through a chain of corridors and catacombs underneath the city. You know that it's a few degrees warmer here in New Middletown than the sun's retained heat can account for, Hubble said. We found big conduits that seemed to bring that slightly warmer air up into the city, so I had the men trace the conduits down to their source. Keniston felt sudden excitement. The source? A big artificial heating plant? No, not that, Hubble said. But here we are now. Have a look for yourself. They had suddenly emerged onto a railed gallery in a vast underground chamber. The narrow gallery was the brink of an abysmal pit, a great circular shaft that dropped into unplumbed blackness. Keniston stared puzzledly. He saw that big conduits led upward out of the pit, and then diverged in all directions. The slightly warmer air comes up from this shaft, Hubble said, nodding toward the pit. He added, I know it sounds impossible, to our engineering experience, but I believe this shaft goes downward many, many miles. I believe it goes down into Earth's core. But Earth's core is incredibly hot, Keniston objected. It was hot, millions of years ago, Hubble corrected. And as it grew cooler, as the surface grew cold, they built this domed city, and maybe others like it, and sank a great shaft downward to bring up heat from the core. But Earth's core is even cooler now, almost cold. And now there is only a trifle of heat from it to warm the city a little. So that's why they couldn't live here anymore. It was the Earth heat they depended on, and that ran out, said Keniston a little hopelessly. The second discovery was made by Jennings, a young auto salesman who headed one of the exploration crews. He brought news of it to the scientists, and Keniston went with Bites and Creasy to see it. It was simply a big, semicircular meeting hall in one of the larger buildings, with tiers of several hundred seats. "A council room, or lecture hall, maybe," said Bites. "But what's unusual about it?" "Look at those seats in the second tier," said Jennings. They saw then what he meant. The seats in that tier were not ordinary metal chairs like the others. They were different from the chairs, and different from each other. Some of them hardly looked like seats at all. One row of them were very wide and flat and low, with broad backs that flared in a little inward. Another row were very narrow seats that had no backs at all. Still, others looked a little like curved lounging chairs, but the curve was an impossibly deep one. "If they're seats," said Jennings, "they weren't intended for ordinary human people to sit in." Keniston and the others looked at each other, startled. He had a sudden grotesque vision of this hall crowded with an audience partly human and partly— what? Had humanity, in the last ages, shared the earth with other races that were not human? "We are all jumping to conclusions." Bite's voice broke the spell. "They may not be seats at all. But," he added to Jennings as they left, "better not tell the people about this. It might upset them." What the other exploration crews had found was summarized in a short speech by Hubble at the big town meeting of Middletown's people held in the plaza on Sunday afternoon. There had been church services that morning, services without bells or organs or stained glass, but held in lofty, shadowy rooms of cathedral solemnity. The first town meeting of New Middletown followed. Loudspeakers had been set up so that all in the big plaza might hear, and Mayor Garris, an older-looking, humbled Mayor Garris, spoke to them. He was stumblingly encouraging. The ration system was working well, he told them. There was no danger of starvation, for hydroponic farming would soon be started. They could live in New Middletown indefinitely, if necessary. "Dr. Hubble," he added, "will tell you of what was found in New Middletown by the exploring crews." Hubble was concise. He emphasized first that the original inhabitants of New Middletown had apparently left it deliberately. "They took their personal belongings, their books, their clothing, their smaller apparatus, instruments and furnishings. What they left were things too massive for easy transportation. That includes certain machinery which we think was atomically powered, but which must be studied with great care before attempts at operation can be made. We feel sure that, in time, study will make it possible to use all such equipment." Mayor Garris rose to add eagerly, "And at least one piece of equipment is now ready to use. Mr. Keniston has got one of the radio transmitters here going, and will now start calling to contact the other people of Earth." A great cheering rose instantly from the gathered Middletowners. Keniston, after the gathering broke up, found himself besieged by excited questioners. Yes, they would start calling right away. He was worried when he got a moment alone with Hubble. "Garris shouldn't have announced that. These people are dead sure now that we'll soon be talking to other peopled cities." Hubble looked worried too. "They're so sure there are other people that it's only a matter of contacting them." Keniston looked at him. "Do you believe there are any others? I'm beginning to doubt it, Hubble. If they couldn't live in this city, they couldn't live anywhere." "Perhaps," Hubble admitted uneasily. "But we can't be sure of anything. We have to try, and keep trying." Keniston started the transmitter that night, using it for only 10 minutes each hour to conserve gasoline as much as possible. "Middletown calling," he spoke into the microphone. "Middletown calling." No use of adding more. They could not yet operate a receiver to hear an answer. They could only call to make known their presence, and wait and hope that any others left on dying Earth would hear and come. Crowds watched from outside the door as he called. They were there through the night, when Bites took over, and there again the next day and the next. They were quite silent, but the hope in their faces made Keniston sick. He felt, as another day and another passed, the mockery of the words he kept repeating. "Middletown calling." Calling to what? To an Earth dying, devoid of human life. To a cold and arid sphere that had done with humanity long ago? Yet he had to keep sending it out. The cry of man lost in the ages and seeking his kind. The cry that he felt there were no ears on Earth to hear. Middletown calling, calling. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9 of The City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 9. Out of the Silence. No answer. Weeks had gone by, while Keniston and Bytes called, and out of the silence of the dying Earth had come no reply. Every hour they had spoken the words that had become meaningless, and between calls they had fumbled with the strange receivers that they did not know how to tune. And nothing at all had happened. Keniston had come to dread the times when he must leave the building and walk through the little crowd of hopeful Middletowners who were always gathered outside. "No, not yet," he had to say, always trying to look confident. "But maybe soon." "And maybe never," Carol said to him hopelessly when they were alone. "If anybody had heard, they could have got here from any part of Earth in these weeks you've been calling." "Perhaps they don't have airplanes," he reminded her. "If they had complicated radio receivers to hear our call, they'd have planes too, wouldn't they?" Her logic was unanswerable. For a moment, Keniston was silent. Then, "Please don't say that to anyone else, Carol. All these people, it's what keeps them going, I think, their hope of finding other people. They wouldn't feel so lost then." He sighed. "We'll keep calling. It's all we can do. And maybe McLean and Creasy will find someone out there. They should be back soon." McLean had succeeded in organizing his motor expedition to explore the surrounding country. It had taken weeks of preparation, of marshalling tank trucks from Middletown to use as gasoline caches at carefully selected points, of laying out tentative routes to follow. 2 weeks before, the little caravan of jeeps and half-tracks had started out, and its return was due. And as it searched the dusty wastes out there, as Keniston and Bytes again and again voiced the unanswered call, work and life and death had marched forward in New Middletown. Hubble had helped lay out the schedule of necessary work. The hydroponic tanks had got to be ready. The whole city had to be cleaned of drifted dust. The supplies brought from Old Middletown had to be inventoried. A board of elected officials had assigned men to their work. Every man had his job, his schedule of hours, his pay in ration tickets. The schools had been set up again. Courts and law functioned once more, though all except serious offenders were liberated on probation. Babies were born in New Middletown each day, and the death toll was heavy at first, most of its victims among the old who could not stand the shock of uprooting. A space of land outside the dome had been carefully fenced in as a cemetery. But underneath all the bustle of new activities, it was a waiting city. A city waiting with terrible eagerness for an answer to that call that went hourly out into the silence. Keniston felt his helplessness. He could not even understand completely the transmitters he used. He had, in these weeks, completely disassembled one of them without being able to puzzle out its circuits. He was sure that it employed radio frequencies far outside the electromagnetic spectrum of 20th century science. But parts of the design were baffling. The words stamped on the apparatus meant nothing. They were in the same completely unknown language as all the city's inscriptions. He could only keep sending out the same questioning, hopeful message into the unknown. "Middletown calling." Finally, McLean's exploring expedition returned. Carol came running to Kenniston with the news. He went with her to the portal, where thousands of Middletowners were already anxiously gathering. "They've had a hard time," said Kenniston, as the jeeps and half-tracks rolled through the portal and came to a halt. McLean, Creasy, and the others were unshaven, dust-smeared, exhausted-looking. Some of them sagged in their seats. McLean's voice boomed to the eager questioners. "Tell you all about it later. Right now, we're pretty beat up." Creasy's tired voice cut in. "Why not tell them now? They'll have to know." He faced the wondering crowd and said, "We found something, yes. We found a city 200 miles west of here. A domed city, just like New Middletown." Bertram Garris asked the question that was in everyone's mind. "Well, were there people in that other city?" Creasy answered softly, "No, there was nobody there. Not a soul. It was dead, and it had been dead a long time." McLean added, "It's true. We saw no sign of life anywhere, except a few little animals on the plains." Carol turned a pale face toward Kenniston. "Then there's no one else? Then we are the last?" A sick silence had fallen on the crowd. They looked at each other numbly. And then Bertram Garris displayed unsuspected capacities of leadership. He got up on one of the half-tracks and spoke cheerfully. "Now, folks, no use to let this news get you down. McLean's party only covered a few 100 miles, and Earth is a mighty big place. Remember that Mr. Kenniston's radio calls are going out every hour." He rattled on with loud heartiness. "We've all been working hard, and we need some recreation. So tonight we're going to have a big get-together in the plaza, a town party. Tell everybody to come." The crowd of Middletowners brightened a little, but as they went away, Kenniston saw that most of them still looked back soberly. He told Garris, "That was a good idea, to take their minds off things." The mayor looked pleased. "Sure, they're just too impatient. They don't realize it may take the other people a good while to answer those calls of yours." Kenniston realized that Garris' confidence had not been assumed. Despite the shattering new revelation, the mayor still had faith that there were other people. But Hubbell was somber when he heard the news. "Another dead city? Then there's no further doubt in my mind. Earth must be lifeless." "Shall I keep sending out the radio call?" Hubbell hesitated. "Yes, Ken, for a while. We don't want to spoil their party tonight." The town party in the plaza that night had the unusual luxury of electric lights, powered by a portable generator. There was a swing band on a platform, and a big space had been roped off for dancing. Kenniston threaded through the crowd with Carol, for Bites had offered to stand his trick. Everyone knew him now and greeted him, but he noticed a significant difference in the greetings. They did not ask him now whether his calls had had an answer. "They're giving up hope," he said to Carol. "They're afraid there are no other people, and they don't want to think about it." Yet the party went well, until Mayor Garris blundered. He had been cheerily backslapping his way through the crowd all evening, admiring babies, exchanging familiar greetings, obviously enjoying this relapse into the arts of politicianship. Flushed and happy, he got up on the band platform and called through the loudspeaker to the crowd. "Come on, folks! How about a little community singing? I'll lead you with my famous tenor. How about 'Let Me Call You Sweetheart'?" They laughed and sang, as the band struck up the tune and the pudgy mayor cheerfully waved his hand like a conductor. The old songs, not heard on Earth for millions of years, echoed off the tall white buildings and the great shimmering dome overhead. But as they sang Banks of the Wabash and Old Kentucky Home, voices and faces lost their brightness. Keniston saw the haunting yearning that came into the gathered thousands of faces, and the mistiness in Carol's eyes. The swell of voices dropped a little. The singer seemed to hesitate. And then, with an hysterical cry, a woman in the crowd sank sobbing to the ground. The singing and the music stopped, and there was nothing but the racking sobs of the woman, whom a man vainly tried to comfort. Keniston heard her crying out, "It's all gone forever! Our whole world and all its people! There's only us, alone on a dead world!" "Let's not get downhearted, folks," pleaded the mayor, but it was too late for that. The spell was broken. The people of Middletown were at last confronted with their awful aloneness. The party was over. The crowd silently dispersed, not speaking to each other, each man going back to his own home, his own thoughts. Keniston tried to find words of comfort for Carol when he left her, but he could not. There was no comfort for anyone, not now. They all had to face it, the certainty that they were the last on Earth. He walked slowly back through the silent, empty streets to relieve Bites. The moon had risen now, and through the great dome it poured coppery light upon the deserted plaza. Then suddenly he stopped and turned, as he heard a voice and running feet pursuing him. "Hey! Hey, Mr. Keniston!" He recognized Bud Martin, who had owned the garage in Old Middletown. Bud's lean young face was excited, and the words came tumbling out of him so fast as to be almost incoherent. "Mr. Keniston, I thought I just saw a plane going over the dome, high up. Only it looked more like a big submarine than a plane, but I saw it. I know I did." Keniston thought that he might have expected this. In their reaction of bitter disappointment, many of the Middletowners might be expected now to see the other people they so longed to see. He said, "I didn't hear anything, Bud." "Neither did I. It went quiet and fast, high up there. I got just a glimpse of it." Keniston looked up with him. They stared for moments, but the moonlit sky was cold and empty. He lowered his gaze. "It must have been a cloud shadow, Bud. There's nothing there." Bud Martin swore, and then said earnestly, "Listen, Mr. Keniston, I'm not an hysterical woman. I saw something." It gave Keniston pause. For a moment his heart quickened. Was it possible? He stared again for long minutes. The sky remained empty, and yet his throb of excitement persisted. He said abruptly, "We'll get Hubble, but don't say anything to anyone else. Stirring up false hopes now would be disastrous." Hubble was with McLean and Creasy in a candlelit room, listening to their account of that other dead city they had found. He heard Bud Martin's eager tale, and then looked at Keniston. "I saw nothing," Keniston admitted. "But through the dome, anything would be hard to see except when it was dead overhead." Hubble rose. "Perhaps we better have a look from outside. Get your coats on." Heavily wrapped, the five of them went along the silent streets to the portal, and through it into the outer night. They walked 100 yards out from the portal, along the sand-drifted highway, and then stopped and scanned the sky. The cold was intense. The big moon shone with a hard, coppery brilliance that washed the looming dome of New Middletown with light. Keniston's gaze swept the blazing chains of stars. The old groups were much changed by the ages, but a few he could still vaguely recognize. The time-distorted Great Bear warding the north, the warped and altered star pattern of the Lyre. And individual stars still burned in unmistakable splendor: the blue-white flaring beacon of Vega, the somber, smoky red magnificence of Antares, the throbbing gold of Altair. "People are going to be seeing plenty of things," said McLean skeptically. "We might as well—" "Listen," said Hubble sharply, holding up his hand. Keniston heard only the whisper of the bitter wind. Then, faintly, he caught a thrumming sound that rose and fell and rose again. "It's from the north," Creasy said suddenly, "and it's coming back around toward us." All five of them were suddenly rigid, held in the grip of an emotion too big for utterance, as they peered at the starry sky. The thrumming deepened. "That's no plane motor!" McLean exclaimed. It wasn't, Keniston knew. It was neither the staccato roar of combustion engines nor the scream of jets, but a deep bass humming that seemed to fill the sky. He was aware that his heart was pounding. Creasy shouted and flung up his hand. They saw it almost at once, an elongated black mass cutting rapidly down across the stars. Bud Martin yelled, "It's coming right down on us!" The thing, in a heartbeat, had become an enormous dark bulk rushing down upon them, looming like a thundercloud. They ran back toward the portal, their feet slipping on the loose sand. "Look!" cried Creasy. "Look at it!" They turned, there at the portal, and Keniston saw now that the downward rush of the black visitant upon them had been only an illusion born of its bigness. For the thing, whatever it was, humming like a million tops, was settling upon the plain a half-mile from New Middletown. Sand spumed up wildly to veil the giant bulk, then fell away and disclosed it resting on the plain. It was, Keniston saw instantly, a ship. Bud Martin's description had been accurate. The thing looked for all the world like a gigantic submarine without a conning tower, that had come down out of the sky to land upon the plain. The deep bass thrumming had stopped. The thing lay there in the moonlight, big, dark, silent. They stared rigidly. "A ship from another world?" Keniston whispered. "A spaceship?" "It must be, but there were no rocket jets. It uses some other kind of power. Why don't they come out of it now they've landed? What did they come here for? Who are they?" The bulky enigma out there brooded, silent, unchanged. Then Keniston heard a calling of voices, a rising uproar in the city behind him. Others had seen and called the news. The uproar of voices and running feet increased. All the thousands in New Middletown were beginning to stream in wild excitement toward the portal. Mayor Garris' pudgy figure ran toward them. "Have they really come? Have the other people come?" Hubbell's voice cracked. "Keep the people back. They mustn't go outside yet. Something has come, we don't know what. Until we do know, we've got to be careful." Into Keniston's mind suddenly flashed the remembrance of that big meeting hall that Jennings had found, with its special section of queer seats that no ordinary human man or woman could have used. He felt a chill along his nerves. What manner of beings were in the looming, monstrous mass out there? Garris sounded a little scared. Why, I never thought that if people came, they might be enemies." He started to shout to the police and National Guardsmen already on hand. "Get those people back, and get your guns!" Presently the crowd had been forced back into the adjacent streets, and a score of armed police and guardsmen waited with Hubbell and Keniston and the others just inside the portal. The mayor, his teeth chattering in the cold, said, "Shall we go out to them?" Hubbell shook his head. "No, we're not sure of anything. We'll wait." They waited, shivering in the cold wind, and as they waited, Keniston's mind rioted with speculation. This great vessel from outer space, whence had it come to dying Earth? From the farther stars? Why had it come? And what was going on inside it now? What eyes were watching them? They waited. All New Middletown waited and watched as the moon swung lordly across the zenith and the stars shifted and the cold deepened. And nothing happened. The monster metal bulk out there lay lightless and without sound. The stars dimmed. Bleak gray light crept up the eastern sky. To Keniston, chafing half-frozen hands, The mighty vessel out on the plain seemed unreal and dreamlike. McLean swore. "If they're not coming to see us, we might as well go out to see them." "Wait," said Hubble. "But we've waited for hours, and—" "Wait," said Hubble again. "They're coming now." Keniston saw. A dark opening had appeared low in the side of the distant looming hull. Figures that were vaguely unreal in the dawn light were emerging from that opening and moving slowly toward New Middletown. End of Chapter 9. Of the City at World's End by Edmond Hamilton. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The City at World's End. Chapter 10. From the Stars. Keniston watched them come, the four vague figures walking slowly through the dawn toward New Middletown. His heart pounded and his mouth was dry, and he was strangely afraid. Perhaps it was the manner of their coming that made him so, the brooding, enigmatic bulk of that unknown ship, that long and cautious silence. It came to him that they too were doubtful. The three leading figures resolved themselves gradually into men, clad in slacks and jackets against the biting cold. The fourth member of the party trudged along some distance behind them, a stocky form veiled in the blowing dust. Mayor Garris said wonderingly, "They look just like us. I guess people haven't changed much after all in 1 billion years." Keniston nodded. For some reason, the cold knot in the pit of his stomach would not relax. There was something overpowering in this incredible meeting of two epochs. He glanced at the others. Their faces were white and tense. There was a feeling of excitement verging almost on hysteria. The strangers were close enough now to distinguish features. The stocky laggard remained indistinct, but of the three who came before, Keniston saw now that only two were men. The third was a blue-eyed woman, tall and lithe, with hair the color of pale gold, smooth coiled about her head. Keniston was struck by her. He had seen more beautiful women, but he had seldom seen one who carried herself with such grace and authority, and who looked at the world with such a direct, intelligent gaze. Almost instantly he resented her, for no more reason than that she made him instantly conscious of the vast horizons of knowledge and experience which were far beyond his present ken. And yet her mouth was friendly, quite a strong mouth, but ready to smile. The younger of the two men was broad and hard and healthy, with sorrel hair and one of those frank, jovial faces that is built over flint. Like the woman's, his attitude was of alert, half-cautious reserve. The other man was thin and untidy and very human. He had none of the cool reserve of his companions. He was excited and showed it, blinking eagerly at the Middletowners. Keniston warmed to him at once. There was a strange silence, and the woman and two men stopped. They looked at the Middletowners, and the Middletowners stared at them. Then the woman said something to her companions in a rapid, unfamiliar tongue. The younger man nodded silently, and the thin, eager man poured out a tumbling flood of words. Mayor Garris stepped forward hesitantly, a paradox of pompous humility. "I—" he said, and stopped. The small word vanished away on the wind, and he could seem to find nothing to replace it. The blonde woman regarded him with her bright gaze, intent and faintly amused. The thin man stepped forward toward them. Forming the words very carefully, he said, "Middletown calling," and again, "Middletown calling." Keniston was shaken by a great amazement. Relief and understanding made him almost giddy for the moment, and he heard again his own tired voice speaking those two hopeless pleading words into a silence that neither heard nor answered. But it had heard. It had answered, from somewhere. From where? Another world? Another star? Not from anywhere on Earth, surely. That great ship had never stooped to make such a paltry journey. He heard Mayor Garris utter a squeaking, strangled cry. A wave of shock, audible in the indrawn breath of every man there, swept the tight-packed group. Keniston's wandering thoughts came back with a start. The fourth member of the party had come up and joined the other three, and Keniston himself was appalled at what he saw. The fourth of the newcomers was not human. Manlike, yes, but not a man. He was tall, his body enormously strong and massive, his thick arms ending in hands like heavy paws. He was clothed in his own shaggy fur, supplemented by a harness-like garment. His head was flattened, its muzzle protruding in the fashion of a beast, his round and tufted ears alert. And his eyes. It was the eyes that were most shocking. They met Keniston's, large and dark and full of a quick, penetrating intelligence. Good-natured eyes, curious, smiling. The mayor had backed away. His face was quite white. He cried out shrilly, "Why, it isn't human!" The furry one looked puzzled by this outburst. He glanced at the woman and the two men, and they all looked at Garris, frowning, as though at a loss to understand his fright. The creature moved toward Garris a step or two, his paw-like hands outstretched. He spoke in a slow, rumbling voice and smiled, showing a row of great teeth that glistened sharp as sabers in the light. Garris shrieked, and Keniston saw panic on the faces of the other men and saw the guns come up. "Wait!" he yelled, and darted forward, thrusting the mayor aside. "For God's sake, wait, you fools!" He faced them, standing so that his body shielded the alien one. He had, himself, a revulsion from that creature that was both beast-like and manlike. But the furry one had looked at him and had smiled. "Don't shoot!" he cried. "It's intelligent! It's one of them!" "Stand aside, Keniston!" shouted the mayor, his voice high with panic. "The brute looks dangerous!" The guns he faced swung sharply away from Keniston. He turned and saw that the four newcomers had suddenly stepped a little to one side. And abruptly, the scene ended. The woman raised her hand in a swift gesture. From the ship out on the plain came a flash of white light. It struck like a snake at all the crowd of Middletowners in the portal. It struck and was gone in an instant. Keniston had been in its path, too. He felt a stunning shock in every nerve of his body. There was only a split second of pain, and then a numbed paralysis, as from an electric shock. He saw Garris and Hubbell and the others stagger, their faces white and shaken. The guns dropped from nerveless hands. Then the furry one trudged toward Keniston. Again his dark eyes smiled. He made reassuring rumbling sounds, and his big paw-like hands kneaded into Keniston's neck with expert deftness. The paralysis of Keniston's nerves began to fade. The sorrel-haired younger man had stepped forward and picked up one of the fallen guns. Incredulity came into his eyes as he examined it. He said something in a sharp voice to the others. They looked the gun over and over. Then, puzzled and startled, they stared at Keniston and at the other Middletowners who now seemed returning to normal. "They've got a death ray or something," choked Bertram Garris. "They can kill us." Hubbell said savagely, "Shut up! You're making an ass of yourself. That weapon was only a non-lethal means of defense that you forced them to use." The woman called excitedly to the furry one. "Gore Hall!" It was, obviously, his name. And Gore Hall rejoined the other three. He, too, uttered sounds of bewilderment as he looked at the gun. Keniston spoke to Hubbell, ignoring Garris and the dazed police. "I think they've just begun to suspect where we came from." The excitement of the four newcomers was obvious. It was the woman, Keniston noticed, who first recovered from that bewilderment. She spoke quickly to the thin blinking man, the one who had so happily repeated, "Middletown calling." From her repeated use of the name, Keniston guessed the man was called Piers Eglin, and Piers Eglin looked the most staggered of all the four, and the most joyful. He came back to Keniston. He almost devoured him with those blinking eyes. "Middletown," he said, and then, after a moment, "Friends." Keniston seized on that. "Friends? Then you speak English?" The word English set Piers Eglin off into a new paroxysm of excitement. He began to babble to the others, but the woman cut him short. He swung back to Keniston. "English language," he almost panted. "You speak English language." Keniston simply nodded. A look of awe crept into Piers Eglin's blinking eyes as he asked, "Who? No." He began again. "Where do you come from?" "From the past," Keniston answered, and felt the full unreality of it as he said it. "From far in the past." "How far?" Keniston realized that 20th century dates would mean little after all these epochs. He thought for a moment. Then he said, "Very far in the past. In our lifetime, atomic power was first released." "So far," whispered Piers Eglin numbly. "But how? How?" Keniston shrugged helplessly. "There was an atomic explosion over our city. We found our whole city in this age. That's all." The thin man feverishly translated for the others. The woman showed deep interest. But it was Gore Hall, the furry one, who made the longest comment in his rumbling voice. Piers Eglin swung back to Keniston, but Keniston stemmed the other's eager questions by a question of his own. "Where do you come from?" The thin one pointed up at the dawn-lit sky. "From—" He seemed trying to remember the ancient name. Then, "From Vega." It was Keniston's turn to be staggered. "But you're Earthmen." He pointed to Gore Hall's furry figure. "And what about him?" Again Piers Eglin seemed to search his memory for a name. Then he said it. "Capella. Gore Hall is from Capella." There was a silence in which the four looked at the men of Middletown. Keniston's mind was a chaotic whirl, out of which one thing stood clear. The televisor radio of this domed city had indeed been far outside his comprehension. That radio had been designed for interstellar distances. That was where the call had gone, and whence it had been answered. From Vega, from Capella, from the stars. "But you speak our old language!" he cried incredulously. Piers Eglin stumblingly explained, "I am an historian, specializing in the pre-atomic Earth civilization. I learned its language from the old records. That is why I asked to leave to accompany this party to Earth." The woman interrupted. She was shivering a little, and she spoke now in a low, rapid voice. Piers Eglin told them, "She is Varn Allen, the administrator of this sector. Here," nodding to the sorrel-haired younger man, "is Norden Lund, the sub-administrator." The words were hard for him to remember, harder still to shape. He added, "Varn Allen asks that we talk inside the city, where it is not so cold." Keniston had guessed that the woman held authority in the group. He was not surprised. Her vibrant forcefulness was striking. Mayor Garris, who was half frozen himself, was only too happy to accede to that request. He turned toward the portal, behind which all the thousands of New Middletown were being held with difficulty. Their masked faces showed as a pale blur through the glass of the dome. "Make way there!" Garris ordered, in his most important tone. He gestured at the sweating guardsmen and police who held the line. "Clear away there now, we're coming in." He raised his voice, speaking to the people beyond. "Stand back, will you? Everything's fine. The other people have come at last, and they want to see our city. So let them through! Let them through!" The crowd, with painful reluctance, made a narrow lane through itself, which was widened by the efforts of the guardsmen. Leading the way for the Star folk, the mayor's dignity was somewhat injured by the uneasiness that caused him to skip hastily ahead with nervous backward glances at Gore Hall's towering figure. But he kept up his jovial front as leader of his people, shouting to them that all was well, that there was nothing to fear, and begging them to keep back and refrain from pushing. Varn Allen was the first one to follow Garrus through the portal. She hesitated just an instant, as she and the jostling eager crowd caught sight of one another, and the crowd sent up a wild-throated roar of cheering that shook the dome. Behind her, Norden Lund grinned and shook his head, as a man might at the bad manners of children. Then Varn Allen smiled at the people and went on, and the edges of the crowd swayed and buckled inward, and the guardsmen swore, and some irreverent soul whistled appreciatively at the tall, lithe woman with the golden hair. They shouted questions at her, 1,000 all at once, and the half-hysterical greetings of people who have waited so long that they have lost hope, and then find it suddenly fulfilled, and Keniston hoped that they would not do anything violent, like carrying her and Norden Lund on their shoulders. He went in right beside Gore Hall. The people had not seen him yet, except as a vague, dark figure beyond the wall of curving glass. When they did, their voice dropped dead still for a moment, and then took up again on a rising note of incredulity and alarm. Women who had shoved and clawed to get in the first row now tried to scramble back out of harm's way, and the edges of the crowd drew sharply apart. Keniston walked close to the big furry Capellan, his hand resting on one mighty shoulder, to show the crowd that they had nothing to fear, and the people stared and stared. "What the devil is it? A pet? Look, it's got clothes on. Don't tell me it's one of them." "Keep it away from me! It's showing its teeth!" Keniston shouted explanations, and under his palm the dark, thick fur was hot and alien, and he was almost as much afraid of Gore Hall as they were. And then, from out of the crowd, a tiny girl came toddling directly into their path. Her eyes shining with childish glee, she ran toward Gore Hall's mighty furry form. "Teddy bear!" she shrieked joyfully. "Teddy bear!" And she flung her arms around his leg. Gore Hall uttered a rumbling laugh. He reached down with his great paw to pat her head, and other children came running, breaking away from fearful mothers, clustering eagerly around the big Capellan as he trudged along. The little girl he hoisted to his shoulder, and she rode there clinging to his ears, and after that it was impossible for anyone to fear him. The tension of the crowd relaxed, and they grinned at each other and laughed. "Sure, it's a pet! Hey, how do you like that? Walking on his hind legs just like a man. Smart, ain't he? Why, you'd almost think he was trying to talk." Piers Eglin, who must have caught at least a part of this, peered sidelong at Gore Hall, but he did not offer to translate. The crowd became a fluid mass flowing along the boulevards, following the strangers. Help and hope and companionship had come at last to New Middletown, and the relief and joy in the faces of the people were wonderful to see. But Keniston watched the faces of the blue-eyed woman and the man Norden Lund, seeing their expressions change from incredulity to a startled acceptance. Piers Eglin was beside himself. A woman's fur coat entranced him. Quite ordinary cheap fur, but from a species of animal that Keniston realized must have been extinct for millions of years. Cloth and leather became treasures unimaginable in his eyes. He talked incessantly, feverishly, pointing out this wonder and that to his companions, lapsing occasionally into his painful English to ask Keniston some questions. And when he saw an automobile, he became perfectly hysterical with excitement. The automobile was of interest to them all. Varn Allen and Norden Lund stopped to examine it, and Gore Hall, gently disengaging himself from his burden of children, joined them. The furry one's quick eye apparently divined where the motive power was hidden away, and he made signs to Keniston that he wanted to see inside. Keniston lifted the hood. Immediately, all four bent over to inspect the motor, and the crowd of Middletowners laughed to see the big, tame pet animal imitating its masters. The Starfolk talked, in their swift, unfamiliar tongue, and Norden Lund pointed to the engine assembly with the same half-mocking wonder that a man of Keniston's day might have felt toward an ox-cart. Gore Hall spoke to Piers Eglin, and the little man turned to Keniston. "So beautiful, so primitive," he whispered, and clasped his hands. "They ask you make it... He was stumped for a word, but Keniston got his meaning. The keys were in the lock. He started the motor. Gore Hall was fascinated. There was a good bit of talking, and then the last cupful of gas in the tank ran out, and the motor died. The Starfolk looked at each other and nodded and went on. Mayor Garrus was now in his finest form. He had lost his terror of Gore Hall in his pride and his excitement. He showed the strangers from the stars the means by which New Middletown had been made livable. He babbled about its government, its schools and courts, the distribution of food. How much of it the strangers got through Piers Eglin's stumbling translations, Keniston could not know, but an unreasoning resentment was growing in him. For he and all the folk of Middletown shared Garrus' pride. They had had a hard time, and they had taken this alien city, and with their own hands and ingenuity, they had made a functioning, decent habitation out of it, and they were proud of that. And all the while they were being proud, the strangers peered at the gasoline pumps and the improvised water system and the precious electric lights that had cost such labor, and were appalled at the crudity and ignorance of these things. They did not need to say so. It was plain in their faces. Presently they stopped and conferred at some length among themselves. Evidently they reached a decision, for Piers Eglin turned and spoke. "We have seen enough for this time," he said. "Later," and here he trembled with eagerness and his eyes shone moistly, like a hound's, "later we will wish to see the old city, which you say still stands. But now Varn Allen says we will return to the ship to report what we have found to Government Center." "Listen," said Keniston urgently. "We need help. We need power, and our fuel is running low." Hubble, who had been nearby through all the visit of the strangers, nodded and said, "If you could start up some of the atomic generators here." Piers Eglin turned at once to consult Varn Allen, who glanced at Keniston and Hubble and nodded. Piers Eglin said, "Of course. She says you should be made as comfortable as possible while you are still here. The crew of the Thanos will help. We will work under Gore Hall, who is our chief atomic technician." The mayor gasped. "That furry brute a technician?" Piers Eglin cleared his throat. "There will be others among the crew. They will be strange to you, but they are also friends. You had better assure your people." Garrus gulped and said, "I'll attend to it. I will act as, yes, interpreter. And now there is much to be done. I will return shortly, with the crew and the necessary, objects." The Starfolk left then, going back as they had come, through the portal and out across the dusty plain. And as they went, Mayor Garrus gave the news to the crowd. Power, more water, more lights, perhaps even heat. The wild, jubilant cheering startled the still heights of the towers, and the dome rang with it, and underneath that cry of joy, Hubble said to Keniston, "What did he mean, 'while we were still here'?" Keniston shook his head. A cold doubt was in him, almost a foreboding. and it was based on nothing that had been said or done, but simply on the realization of the abyss that separated the civilization of old Middletown from civilization that had gone out among the stars so far and so long ago that Earth was almost forgotten. He wondered how well those two incredibly disparate cultures were going to understand each other. He stood for a long while, wondering, watching the crowd disperse, and even the thought that soon the big generators would be humming again could not dispel his worry. End of chapter 10.